23rd November 1942, Kalach on the Don, Soviet Union. The radio operator's message came through at 19:16 hours, and in that instant, the fate of 290,000 men was sealed. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm Adam watched General Friedrich Paulus's face drain of color as he read the decoded transmission. Soviet tank columns had broken through the Romanian lines to the north and south of Stalingrad. The two pincers had met at the bridge over the Don River. The word Adam dreaded hearing echoed through the command bunker. Kessel, the pocket. The entire Sixth Army was now encircled, trapped in a frozen hell between the Don and the Volga. Outside, snow fell softly on the steppe, beautiful and indifferent. Paulus's hand trembled as he reached for the telephone to Hitler's headquarters. In that moment, Adam realized they were witnessing a crossroads in history, a decision point where one choice could mean survival and continued resistance, while another meant certain destruction. What Paulus didn't yet know, what none of them could fully comprehend, was that the next 72 hours would determine not just the fate of the Sixth Army, but potentially the entire outcome of the war in the East. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War, stories of courage, tragedy, and the decisions that shaped the course of history. Where are you watching from today? And if you had been in Paulus's position with 290,000 men depending on your decision, what would you have done? To understand whether Germany could have won the war, or at least avoided catastrophic defeat if the Sixth Army had escaped Stalingrad, we must first examine what led to the encirclement and what the German position looked like in late 1942. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun on 22 June 1941 with 3 million German troops smashing across the Soviet border. The initial advances were staggering, entire Soviet armies encircled, hundreds of thousands of prisoners taken, vast territories conquered. But the drive on Moscow had failed in the brutal winter of 1941-1942, and Hitler had redirected German strategy southward. Operation Blue, launched in the summer of 1942, aimed to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. By August, General Friedrich Paulus and his Sixth Army had reached Stalingrad. What was supposed to be a quick capture turned into a grinding urban battle that consumed German divisions in weeks of savage street fighting. By late November, the Germans controlled 90% of the ruined city, but General Vasily Choikov's Soviet 62nd Army clung to narrow strips along the Volga, refusing to break. Behind the scenes, General Georgy Zhukov had been planning something audacious. Operation Uranus would strike at the weak Romanian and Hungarian armies guarding the German flanks, encircle the Sixth Army, and turn the hunters into the hunted. Throughout October and November, the Soviets secretly massed over 1 million troops, 13,500 artillery pieces, and 900 tanks north and south of Stalingrad. German intelligence detected some movement, but catastrophically underestimated its scale. On 19th November, the trap sprang shut. Soviet artillery obliterated Romanian positions. T-34 tanks and infantry poured through the gaps. Within 4 days, Soviet pincers met at Kalach, 50 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The Sixth Army, along with elements of the 4th Panzer Army, 2 Romanian divisions and support units, was now trapped in a pocket roughly 60 kilometers wide. Over 290,000 Axis soldiers found themselves cut off from supply, surrounded, with winter closing in. This was the moment that would define everything that followed, and it's here we must ask, what if Germany had made different decisions? What if Paulus had been allowed, or had chosen, to break out immediately? In the actual timeline, Paulus's first instinct was correct. On the evening of 23rd November, he drafted urgent requests to Hitler's headquarters asking for permission to withdraw westward.
Every staff officer in the 6th Army headquarters understood the reality. The Soviet encirclement was still weak, the winter weather hadn't yet become impassable, and German units still had fuel and ammunition. A breakout operation launched immediately, within 24 to 48 hours, had a reasonable chance of success. The bulk of the 6th Army could escape, regroup, and continue fighting. But Hitler refused. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring promised that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped army by air, 500 tons per day, he claimed, the minimum needed to sustain operations. Hitler ordered Paulus to hold Stalingrad and await relief from outside. Paulus, the obedient staff officer, complied with the order, and that decision doomed his army. But what if Paulus had defied Hitler? What if he had ordered an immediate breakout on his own authority, gambling that success would vindicate his disobedience? Military historians have debated this counterfactual scenario for decades, and the implications are staggering. Let's explore what might have happened if the 6th Army had attempted to break out in late November 1942. The window of opportunity was narrow but real. Between 23rd and 26th November, the Soviet encirclement was still forming and relatively thin in places. Soviet forces were overstretched, their logistics strained by rapid advances. If Paulus had immediately ordered his mobile units, the 14th and 24th Panzer Divisions still possessing functional tanks and fuel, to spearhead a breakout to the southwest, they could have punched through Soviet lines. The bulk of the infantry would have followed, abandoning heavy equipment and non-essential vehicles, marching through the freezing steppe toward German lines 40 to 50 kilometers away. It would have been costly. The Soviets would have pounded the retreating columns with artillery and airstrikes. Rear guard units would have been sacrificed to buy time. Thousands of wounded would have to be left behind. But conservative estimates suggest that 180,000 to 220,000 German soldiers could have escaped the pocket, compared to the 6,000 who eventually returned from Soviet captivity in the actual timeline. This represents a difference of roughly 200,000 experienced combat troops who could have continued fighting. One German staff officer, Lieutenant Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, later wrote in his memoirs, "If Paulus had broken out when encircled, we could have saved 70 to 80% of the 6th Army. Those divisions, reconstituted and rested, would have been available for the battles of 1943. The strategic implications are almost impossible to calculate."
Let's follow this alternative timeline and examine what preserving the 6th Army might have meant for Germany's strategic position. By late November 1942, Germany's military situation was already precarious, though not yet desperate. In North Africa, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had been defeated at El Alamein and was retreating westward across Libya. Allied forces had landed in Algeria and Morocco during Operation Torch on 8 November, opening a second front. The Wehrmacht was fighting on multiple fronts with increasingly stretched resources. In this scenario where the 6th Army escapes, Germany would still have faced serious challenges. The Soviets had demonstrated they could mass forces and execute sophisticated operational plans. The initiative in the east was shifting to the Red Army, but the survival of the 6th Army would have provided Germany with critical resources at a pivotal moment. Consider the numbers. The 6th Army that marched into Stalingrad was one of the Wehrmacht's premier formations, battle-hardened veterans with experience in France, the Balkans, and nearly 2 years of combat in Russia. It comprised 13 infantry divisions, 3 motorized divisions, 3 panzer divisions, and 1 anti-aircraft division, approximately 270,000 combat troops when including attached units. If even 200,000 of these soldiers had been extracted from Stalingrad, they could have been reorganized into 8 to 10 full-strength divisions by spring 1943. These divisions would have been available for Operation Citadel, the German offensive at Kursk in July 1943. In the actual timeline, Germany attacked with roughly 780,000 troops and 2,700 tanks. Adding 8 to 10 veteran divisions, perhaps 100,000 additional troops, and 200 to 300 additional tanks could have significantly altered the battle.
Field Marshal Erich von Manstein later argued that Kursk failed partly due to insufficient reserves. With the 6th Army's divisions available, Germany might have achieved a breakthrough and encircled significant Soviet forces, potentially delaying or preventing the Soviet advance that followed. Moreover, preserving these troops would have addressed Germany's increasingly critical manpower shortage. By 1943, the Wehrmacht was scraping the bottom of the barrel, drafting older men, reducing training time, and pulling garrison troops from occupied territories. Every division destroyed meant resources that could never be replaced. The soldiers lost at Stalingrad represented not just immediate combat power, but training capacity, leadership experience, and institutional knowledge that took years to develop. But would this have been enough to change the war's outcome? That's where the analysis becomes more complex. Even with the 6th Army preserved, Germany faced fundamental strategic problems that would have been difficult to overcome. The Soviet Union's industrial base, much of it relocated beyond the Ural Mountains and out of German reach, was producing tanks, aircraft, and ammunition at rates that dwarfed German production. The United States had entered the war with its vast industrial capacity now fully mobilized. The German economy, despite being placed on a total war footing by 1943, simply couldn't match the combined output of its enemies. Strategically, Germany was fighting a multi-front war it couldn't win. Even if the 6th Army had escaped Stalingrad, Soviet forces would have continued their winter offensive of 1942-1943, recapturing Rostov and threatening to cut off Army Group A in the Caucasus. German forces would still have been forced into a general retreat. The question is whether the presence of additional veteran divisions might have allowed Germany to stabilize the front more effectively, conduct more orderly withdrawals, and preserve more combat power for 1943.
Let's examine what Field Marshal von Manstein accomplished with the forces he actually had. In February and March 1943, Manstein conducted a brilliant counteroffensive around Kharkov, destroying several Soviet armies and temporarily stabilizing the southern front. Imagine if Manstein had possessed 8 to 10 additional experienced divisions from the rescued 6th Army. Could he have exploited his victory more thoroughly? Could he have recaptured more territory, destroyed more Soviet units, and created conditions for a more favorable negotiated settlement? Some military historians argue yes. Colonel David Glantz, one of the foremost Western experts on the Eastern Front, has suggested that the loss of the 6th Army was a catastrophic turning point, not just because of the immediate losses, but because it shattered German confidence and dramatically improved Soviet morale. If the 6th Army had escaped Stalingrad, the psychological impact would have been different. German soldiers would have maintained some belief in their ultimate victory. Soviet forces would have been denied their first major encirclement success against a German field army. But other historians are more skeptical. Professor Richard Overy, an expert on World War II, argues that by 1943, Germany had already lost the war in any meaningful sense. It just didn't know it yet. The Soviet Union's population was 3 times Germany's. Its territory, even after German conquests, was vast. Its industrial capacity, once fully mobilized, was superior. The entry of the United States meant Germany now faced an enemy with unlimited resources. In this view, preserving the 6th Army would have merely prolonged the inevitable, perhaps extending the war by 6 months to a year, but not changing its ultimate outcome. Yet there's another dimension to consider: the possibility of a negotiated peace. In late 1942 and early 1943, some elements within Germany were beginning to contemplate that total victory might be impossible. If the 6th Army had escaped Stalingrad, Germany's bargaining position in any potential peace negotiations would have been significantly stronger. A Germany that hadn't suffered such a catastrophic defeat might have been able to negotiate from a position of at least holding valuable territory, rather than facing inevitable defeat. Consider the diplomatic situation. Stalin, despite his public rhetoric, was pragmatic. If Germany had demonstrated continued military capability by preserving the 6th Army and conducting effective defensive operations through 1943, the Western Allies might have faced pressure to negotiate a settlement that left Germany with some conquests in the East. This was Churchill's nightmare scenario, that Soviet and German exhaustion might lead to a compromise peace that left Hitler in power and Germany dominant in Central Europe. Of course, this scenario requires several unlikely developments. Hitler would have needed to accept limited objectives rather than demanding total victory.
The German General Staff would have needed to gain more influence over strategic decisions. The Western Allies would have needed to be willing to accept a compromise rather than demanding unconditional surrender. All of these were improbable given the personalities and political realities of 1942-43. But it's worth noting that the catastrophic loss at Stalingrad eliminated any possibility of negotiated settlement. After February 1943, Germany was clearly on the path to total defeat. The only questions were how long it would take and how much destruction would occur before the end. If the Sixth Army had escaped, that trajectory might have been less certain, at least for a time.
There is also the matter of German morale and civilian support. The disaster at Stalingrad was a psychological shock to the German home front. Goebbels' propaganda had assured Germans that victory was inevitable, that the Wehrmacht was invincible. When news of the Sixth Army's destruction could no longer be hidden, German civilians began to doubt. If the army had escaped, even at heavy cost, the propaganda narrative of German military superiority could have been maintained longer, perhaps sustaining home front morale and war production into 1944. Let's return to the specific decisions and examine the immediate military consequences more closely. If Paulus had ordered a breakout on 24th or 25th November, the operation would have looked something like this. The 14th and 24th Panzer Divisions, comprising perhaps 100 to 120 tanks and assault guns, would spearhead the attack southwest toward the Don River crossings. They would be followed by motorized infantry and the fittest infantry divisions. The attack would target the junction between Soviet armies, the weakest point in the encirclement. Artillery would provide covering fire. The Luftwaffe, which still had significant presence in the region, would provide air support. The Soviets would react quickly, shifting reserves to contain the breakout. Soviet tanks and infantry would race to block the German escape route. Soviet artillery and airstrikes would hammer the German columns. It would have been a running battle across 50 kilometers of frozen steppe, fought in blizzard conditions with temperatures dropping toward -20 Celsius. German casualties would have been severe. Rearguard units would be overrun. The wounded would have to be abandoned, a terrible moral and practical burden. Perhaps 30,000 to 50,000 German soldiers would be killed, wounded, or captured during the breakout itself. Heavy equipment, tanks running out of fuel, artillery pieces too heavy to move quickly, would have to be destroyed to prevent capture. It would have been a defeat, a retreat, a humiliation. But 200,000 soldiers would have lived. Those men could have been reorganized into 8 combat-effective divisions by spring 1943. To put this in perspective, at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, Germany's Southern Panzer, Army Group South, contained about 17 Panzer and Panzergrenadier divisions plus supporting infantry. Adding 8 veteran divisions to this force, a 40% increase in strength, could have been decisive. One Wehrmacht staff officer in post-war interviews estimated that if the Sixth Army had escaped Stalingrad and those divisions had been available at Kursk, Germany might have achieved a breakthrough at Prokhorovka, the critical tank battle that halted the German advance. A breakthrough there could have led to the encirclement of significant Soviet forces, potentially destroying 40 to 50 Soviet divisions. Such a victory wouldn't have won the war for Germany, but it might have delayed the Soviet advance by 6 months to a year, allowing Germany to construct more formidable defensive positions and possibly negotiate from strength. But we must also consider the broader context of 1943-1944. Even if Germany had inflicted a major defeat on Soviet forces at Kursk, the strategic fundamentals remained unchanged. The Western Allies were planning Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, for spring or summer 1944. Allied strategic bombing was devastating German industry and cities. German oil supplies were critically short. The Kriegsmarine had effectively lost the Battle of the Atlantic by mid-1943. Italy was on the verge of collapse.
In this alternative timeline, even a preserved Sixth Army and a German victory at Kursk would merely have delayed the inevitable. The Soviet Union could replace its losses. Germany increasingly could not. Every month that passed saw Soviet industry producing more tanks, more aircraft, more artillery. Soviet tactical capabilities improved dramatically through 1943-44 as the Red Army learned from its mistakes and developed sophisticated operational art. Perhaps the most realistic assessment is this. If the Sixth Army had escaped Stalingrad, Germany might have extended the war in the East into late 1945 or even early 1946. The German defensive lines might have been more stable. Individual battles might have gone differently. But the ultimate outcome, total German defeat, would likely have remained the same. The Soviet Union's advantages in population, territory, and industrial capacity were simply too great. There's a tragic irony here. The loss at Stalingrad was catastrophic for Germany, but an escape would have merely prolonged the agony. More Soviet cities would have been destroyed. More Soviet civilians would have died. More German soldiers would have been killed in battles fought months or years later. The Holocaust would have continued longer, claiming additional victims. The war's end would have been delayed, but not its outcome. Some German officers understood this even in 1942-43. General Heinz Guderian, the panzer expert, later wrote, "After Stalingrad, I knew the war was lost, but even if we had avoided Stalingrad, I wonder if we could have won. We were fighting enemies with unlimited resources while our own were exhausted. Every battle we won came at a cost we couldn't afford, while our enemies could replace their losses indefinitely." Yet within this grim calculus, there remains the human dimension. For the 290,000 men of the Sixth Army, the difference between death in the Stalingrad pocket and survival through a breakout was everything. These weren't abstract strategic units, they were fathers and sons, husbands and brothers. In the actual timeline, over 200,000 died in the pocket or in Soviet captivity. In an alternative timeline where the army escaped, most of those men would have lived, at least for a time. Many would have survived the war, returned home, rebuilt their lives, had children and grandchildren. One survivor of Stalingrad, Corporal Wilhelm Hoffmann, kept a diary until his death in the pocket in January 1943. His final entry read, "The horses have long been eaten. I would eat a cat. They have long since disappeared. This morning I had to trade my watch for a small piece of bread. I wonder how much longer we must suffer." If the army had broken out, Hoffmann might have survived, might have returned to his family in Munich, might have lived a full life. Multiply that by 200,000, and you begin to grasp the human cost of the decision to stay and fight in the pocket.
For these men and their families, the strategic arguments about whether Germany could have won the war are almost beside the point. The immediate question was survival. A breakout might not have changed the war's ultimate outcome, but it would have saved countless individual lives. That is its own form of victory, even within a larger defeat. But we must also consider the Soviet perspective. The destruction of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad was a tremendous psychological and strategic victory for the Soviet Union. It proved that the Red Army could defeat the Wehrmacht in a major engagement. It provided a massive morale boost to Soviet soldiers and civilians who had suffered catastrophic losses in 1941-42. If the German army had escaped, that psychological victory would have been denied to the Soviets, and the war in the East might have taken on a different character, one with less Soviet confidence and more cautious operations. The ultimate answer to our title question, could Germany have won if they'd escaped Stalingrad, depends on how we define winning. If we mean total victory, conquest of the Soviet Union and German domination of Europe, then the answer is almost certainly no. The fundamental imbalance of resources was too great. The Soviet Union was too large, its population too numerous, its industrial capacity, once fully mobilized, too productive. The United States was too powerful. The British Empire, though strained, was still a formidable enemy. Germany, for all its tactical excellence and initial advantages, couldn't overcome the combined might of these adversaries. If we mean avoiding total defeat and negotiating a settlement that left Germany with some gains, then the answer is possibly, but unlikely. It would have required not just the preservation of the Sixth Army, but a fundamental change in German strategy, Hitler's removal from strategic decision-making, and a willingness by the Allies to negotiate, all of which were improbable.
If we mean extending the war and making German defeat more costly for the Allies, then the answer is yes. The Sixth Army's divisions, preserved and reconstituted, could have inflicted significantly more damage on Soviet and eventually Western Allied forces. The war might have lasted months or even a year longer, but this would have been victory only in the most Pyrrhic sense: more death, more destruction, more suffering, leading to the same ultimate outcome. The tragic reality is that by November 1942, Germany had probably already lost the war in any meaningful sense. The question wasn't whether Germany would be defeated, but when and at what cost. The loss of the Sixth Army accelerated that timeline and increased the certainty of defeat. Its preservation might have altered the details: which battles were won or lost, where the final lines were drawn, how many people died on each side, but not the fundamental trajectory. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's chief of staff, said at the Nuremberg trials, "Stalingrad was the turning point of the war. After that, we were fighting for survival, not victory." But when pressed about whether a German escape from Stalingrad could have changed the outcome, Keitel replied, "Perhaps it would have delayed the end, but once America entered the war and Soviet industry moved beyond our reach, we were always going to lose. Stalingrad just made it obvious."
As we look back across the decades, the counterfactual of a Sixth Army breakout from Stalingrad remains one of history's most haunting what-ifs. The decision to stay and fight in the pocket, made by Hitler and accepted by Paulus, condemned nearly 300,000 men to death or captivity. It was one of the worst military disasters in history, a catastrophe that shocked the German nation and marked a clear turning point in the war. But even if different decisions had been made, even if Paulus had defied Hitler and ordered an immediate breakout, even if 200,000 soldiers had escaped to fight another day, the arc of the war would likely have bent toward the same conclusion. Germany was fighting a war it couldn't win against enemies with superior resources, fighting on too many fronts, led by a dictator whose strategic judgment was fatally flawed. The preservation of the Sixth Army might have bought time, 6 months, perhaps a year. It might have made individual battles go differently. It might have saved hundreds of thousands of lives in the short term, though perhaps at the cost of extending the war and ultimately causing even more deaths. But it almost certainly wouldn't have achieved German victory or even a truly favorable negotiated peace. This is the bitter lesson of Stalingrad. The catastrophic defeats can accelerate the timeline of a war already lost, but avoiding those defeats doesn't necessarily change the destination. Germany's path to defeat was set by decisions made long before November 1942, the decision to invade the Soviet Union, the decision to declare war on the United States, the decision to pursue genocidal policies that made compromise impossible, the decision to place a megalomaniacal dictator in supreme command of military operations. Stalingrad was where these earlier decisions came home to roost. The Sixth Army paid the price for Hitler's strategic incompetence, but even if they had escaped, they would have been fighting in a war their nation was destined to lose. So when we imagine Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm Adam in that command bunker on 23 November 1942, watching Paulus read the encirclement report, we should ask not just what if they had escaped, but what would that escape have truly meant? For the individual soldiers, it would have meant life instead of death, and that is no small thing. For the strategic balance of the war, it would have meant a different path to the same ultimate destination. And perhaps that's the deepest tragedy of Stalingrad. The catastrophe wasn't just that 290,000 men were trapped and destroyed, it was that their destruction, while accelerating Germany's defeat, probably didn't fundamentally alter it. They died in a lost cause that was lost regardless of what happened in that frozen pocket on the Volga. Their sacrifice bought nothing except a slightly shorter war, which, from the perspective of Hitler's victims, was perhaps the only mercy in the whole terrible story. The ghosts of Stalingrad haunt not just because of what happened there, but because of what it reveals about the nature of war, strategy, and the limits of military force when divorced from political and economic reality. Could Germany have won if they'd escaped Stalingrad? The answer is almost certainly no, but the 200,000 men who might have lived to see their homes again, for them, escape would have been everything.
But while the fate of the Sixth Army was sealed at Stalingrad, another crucial battle was reaching its climax in the Pacific, a 6-month struggle for a jungle island that would determine whether Japan or America controlled the sea lanes of the South Pacific. Join us next time as we uncover the brutal campaign for Guadalcanal, where Marines and sailors fought in conditions just as hellish as Stalingrad, but for stakes that would shape the entire Pacific War. Subscribe now and never miss a story from the conflict that changed our world forever.